Sir, I confess that I am a single mother, said the maid with a trembling voice, as she invited the millionaire to Christmas dinner. He looked at her in silence, never imagining that this night would change both their lives forever. Joanna's hands trembled slightly as she held the invitation she had just uttered. The silence that followed seemed eternal. Inside that luxurious kitchen in the SES mansion. You're inviting me to dinner at your house on Christmas Eve, Antonio says, finally asked her employer with a mixture of surprise and disbelief in his voice. Joanna felt the blush rising to her cheeks. What was I thinking? She had only been working as a domestic employee in that mansion for 3 weeks, and she had dared to invite the millionaire, Antonio says, to her home. The desperation to give Miguel a decent Christmas Eve had clouded her judgment. Forgive my boldness, sir, she murmured, lowering her gaze to the Italian marble floor she had polished that very morning. I shouldn't have suggested such a thing. Antonio observed her intently with those dark eyes that seemed to evaluate every situation, like a possible business transaction. You haven't answered me, Joanna. Why are you inviting me? He insisted, his voice lacking its usual coldness. Joanna raised her gaze, finding courage in some corner of her being. Because no one should spend Christmas alone, she replied sincerely. I've noticed that you seem not to enjoy these dates, she completed, choosing her words carefully, aware that she was treading on dangerous ground by commenting on her boss's personal life. What do you mean? He encouraged her to continue with genuine curiosity. And I thought maybe you'd like to share a simple but warm dinner. Instead of, she stopped again. Instead of dining alone in this huge empty house, he completed with a bitter smile that surprised Joanna. You're quite observant. Silence settled between them again, only interrupted by the tick-tock of the wall clock. Antonio ran a hand through his perfectly combed hair, a gesture Joanna had noticed he made when something disturbed him. May I ask with whom else you would share this dinner? He finally asked. Joanna's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't mentioned Miguel at any point during the 3 weeks she had been working there. For some reason, she had always avoided talking about her status as a single mother, perhaps out of fear of being judged or because she had learned from experience that many employers avoided hiring single mothers, considering them less reliable or available. Just me, she began hesitantly. Your husband, family, Antonio continued. Joanna took a deep breath. If he accepted the invitation, he would eventually find out. With my son, she finally replied. My 5-year-old son, Miguel. Something changed subtly in Antonio's expression. It wasn't rejection, as Joanna feared, but something harder to decipher. I didn't know you had a son, he commented. I didn't mention it during the job interview, Joanna admitted, feeling a pang of guilt. Sometimes being a single mother closes doors. Uttering those words produced a sensation of vulnerability she hadn't anticipated. She was exposing not only her personal situation but also admitting a small lie by omission that could cost her the job she needed so badly. Antonio studied her for a moment that seemed eternal. I understand, he finally said without adding any judgment. What time would this dinner be? Joanna blinked in surprise. He was considering accepting. At 7, she replied, trying to hide her astonishment. It's a small house in the Los Flores neighborhood. It's nothing luxurious. But what should I bring? He interrupted, with a practical tone that contrasted with the almost surreal situation. Nothing, please, Joanna hurried to say. Just your company. Antonio nodded slightly, as if closing a deal. I'll give you an answer tomorrow, he said, returning to his professional tone. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a pending call. And with that, he left the kitchen, leaving Joanna with a mixture of relief, anxiety, and surprise. What had she done? She had really invited her wealthy boss, a man who probably dined in the country's most exclusive restaurants, to her small apartment, where she and Miguel barely fit. That night, as she returned home by bus, Joanna mentally reviewed the conversation. The bus rattled through streets decorated with Christmas lights, creating an almost cruel contrast between the colorful joy outside and the storm of worries raging inside her. "Mom," Miguel exclaimed as soon as she opened the door, running to hug her with that inexhaustible energy only children possess. Joanna held him close, feeling her worries temporarily dissolve in the warmth of that small body. Miguel, with his big brown eyes and smile missing a front tooth, was the reason she got up every morning to face a world that had rarely been kind to her. "How did you behave with Dona Carmen?" she asked, referring to the elderly neighbor who watched Miguel after school until she returned from work. "Good," he replied, dragging her to the small table where he had arranged his drawings. "Look what I made today." Joanna looked with tenderness at the childish drawing. A Christmas tree next to two figures that clearly represented them, and a little farther away, a third figure. "Who is this?" she asked, pointing to the third character. "It's Santa," Miguel replied naturally. "He's coming to have dinner with us on Christmas." Joanna felt a knot in her throat. Miguel had never known his father, who had disappeared when she was just 2 months, pregnant with the excuse of going to buy cigarettes, though she had never allowed herself to collapse over it, knowing deep down that man lacked the makings of a father. She sometimes noticed how Miguel invented substitute father figures in his games and drawings. "It's beautiful, my love," she said, kissing his forehead. "Now, let's have dinner. Tomorrow there's school." As she prepared a simple dinner with the ingredients she had bought on sale over the weekend, Joanna couldn't stop thinking about Antonio SES and her impulsive invitation. What would he say if he saw the conditions they lived in? Her apartment, though clean and orderly, consisted of just a small living dining room, a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a bedroom she shared with Miguel. During the 3 weeks she had been working at the SES mansion, she had observed her employer with the discretion of someone accustomed to going unnoticed. Antonio says at 40 years old was a man who exuded power and confidence. His impeccable suits, distinguished bearing, and serious expression inspired immediate respect. However, Joanna had noticed something beyond that perfect facade, a deep loneliness that seemed to follow him like a shadow, especially visible during the dinners he invariably took alone, reviewing documents or his cell phone. The enormous mansion, with its 6 bedrooms and luxurious minimalist decor, seemed more like a mausoleum than a home. It was precisely that loneliness that had prompted Joanna to make that imprudent invitation. The idea of that man with all his money and power spending Christmas Eve alone in that cold house seemed inexplicably sad to her. "Mom, can we play Christmas carols?" Miguel asked, interrupting her thoughts. Joanna smiled, connecting her old phone to the small speaker she had bought at a garage sale. "Of course, my life." The notes of Silent Night filled the small apartment, creating a warm atmosphere that contrasted with the December cold seeping through the poorly sealed windows. As Miguel sang off-key, following the melody with childish enthusiasm, Joanna wondered how Antonio SES would react to this everyday scene. Would he feel uncomfortable? Would he regret accepting? Or perhaps, just perhaps, would he find something valuable in this simplicity that his money couldn't buy? The next morning dawned cold and gray. Joanna dropped Miguel at school and headed to the SES mansion with her heart pounding. What would Antonio's answer be? Had he considered her bold invitation a lack of respect? Was her job at risk? She entered through the service door, as every morning, and went straight to the kitchen to prepare her employer's breakfast. At exactly 7:30, Antonio SES appeared in the dining room, dressed in one of his impeccable dark suits and checking his phone with a concentrated expression. "Good morning, sir," Joanna greeted as she served the black coffee he drank every morning. "Good morning," he replied without looking up from the device. Joanna held her breath. Should she mention the previous day's conversation, or was it better to act as if it had never happened? She opted for silence, continuing with her tasks while feeling the weight of uncertainty. It was Antonio who finally broke the silence. Abatuper his invitation. Joanna began by setting the phone down on the table. "I've decided to accept." Joanna almost spilled the juice she was serving. Had she heard right? "Really?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. "Yes," he replied seriously, "though I would like to set one condition." Joanna's heart sank. Here came the part where he would impose some impossible or degrading demand. "What condition, sir?" she asked cautiously. "Allow me to contribute to the dinner," he said. "I wouldn't feel comfortable arriving empty-handed." Joanna exhaled the air she hadn't realized she was holding. That was the condition. "It's not necessary, really," she tried to protest. "I insist," he cut in with a tone that brooked no reply. "It's the least I can do." Joanna nodded, slowly, not knowing what else to say. The conversation had taken a turn she hadn't expected. When she looked up, she noticed Antonio watching her with an indecipherable expression. "May I ask you a personal question, Joanna?" he said suddenly. "Of course," she replied, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the question. "Why me?" Antonio asked directly, as always. "We barely know each other. I'm your employer, not a friend. Why invite me to share such a family date?" The question hit Joanna with the force of its honesty. Why? Indeed, even she didn't have it completely clear. "Because everyone deserves Christmas company," she finally replied. "Even those who think they don't need it." The words hung between them, loaded with a meaning neither dared to fully explore. Antonio held her gaze for a few seconds that seemed eternal before nodding slightly. "At 7 then," he said, picking up his phone. Again, ending the conversation. Joanna left the dining room with her heart pounding. She had done it. She had invited her boss to Christmas Eve dinner, and he had accepted. Now all that remained was to face the consequences of that impulsive decision. The days following that conversation passed with a strange tension in the SES mansion. Joanna continued with her usual tasks: cleaning, cooking, keeping the enormous residence in order, which seemed too large for one man. However, something had changed in the dynamic between her and her employer. Antonio watched her more attentively during breakfast, asking casual questions about Miguel that showed genuine, though contained, interest. What did he like to study? What were his favorite toys? Joanna answered with a mixture of surprise and caution, unaccustomed to anyone, especially her boss, showing interest in her son. "He's a very creative child," she told him one morning while serving coffee. "He can spend hours drawing or inventing stories with his few toys." Antonio nodded thoughtfully. "And what has he asked for Christmas?" he asked with a casual tone that didn't quite hide his curiosity. Joanna tensed slightly. Miguel's letter to Santa Claus included a bicycle that was completely out of her budget. She had been saving for months to buy a small art set she had seen on sale instead. "He likes drawing," she replied vaguely. "Something related to that would make him happy." Antonio didn't press, but Joanna noticed how his eyes carefully registered her evasive
Response.
As Christmas Eve approached, Joanna increased her work hours. After her shift at the SES mansion, she spent the afternoons preparing traditional Mexican sweets to sell to neighbors and nearby shops. Roscota Reyes, Buñuelos, sweet tamales. The extra money would allow her to buy the ingredients for the special dinner and perhaps a small additional gift for Miguel. Fatigue was beginning to show on her face. Dark circles deepened under her eyes, and sometimes during her tasks at the mansion, she had to pause for a moment to regain energy. It was during one of those brief rests 3 days before Christmas Eve that Antonio surprised her leaning against the kitchen counter with her eyes closed. "Are you all right, Joanna?" he asked, startling her. She straightened up immediately, embarrassed. "Yes, sir." "Excuse me, it was just a moment of tiredness," he completed, observing her with an expression that seemed almost one of
concern.
"You're working too much." "I'm fine, really," she insisted, resuming food preparation. Antonio lingered in the kitchen, unusual for him, who normally avoided the domestic spaces of the house. "I've noticed you stay late," he commented. "May I ask what you do after finishing here?" Joanna hesitated. She didn't want to seem like she was begging with passion, but she saw no reason to lie. "I prepare sweets to sell," she replied
simply.
"It helps with December's extra expenses." Antonio nodded, his face inscrutable. "I understand," he said before abruptly changing the subject. "About Christmas Eve dinner, I'll need the exact address." Joanna wrote her address on a small piece of paper, feeling a renewed wave of nervousness. Until then, Antonio's acceptance of her invitation had seemed abstract, almost unreal. But now, with the exchange of concrete details, the situation was becoming tangible in a way that scared her. "It's the yellow building, apartment 3B, she added, handing him the paper. "It's very simple." "I'll find it," he replied, pocketing the address in his suit. That afternoon, when picking up Miguel from Dona Carmen's, Joanna found him especially excited. "Mommy, mommy," the child exclaimed, jumping into her arms. "And today the teacher told us we have to make a drawing of our family for Christmas." Joanna's heart skipped a beat. School activities related to family were always complicated for Miguel. In an environment where most of his classmates drew mom, dad, and maybe siblings, the little one often felt different. "And what are you going to draw, my love?" she asked cautiously as they walked home under the weak afternoon light. "You, me, and the man who's coming to dinner on Christmas," Miguel replied naturally. Joanna stopped dead in her tracks. "What man, Miguel?" "The important man who's coming to our house," the child explained as if it were obvious. "Dona Carmen told me a very important man is coming to have dinner with us." Joanna closed her eyes for a moment. She would have to talk seriously with the old woman about the limits of what she could comment on. With Miguel, she had barely mentioned casually to Dona Carmen that her boss would come to dinner, and now her son was already including him in a family drawing. "Miguel, that man is my boss," she explained patiently. "He's just coming to share dinner with us because he has no family to spend Christmas with. He's not part of our family." The child's expression darkened slightly. "But you said no one should be alone on Christmas," he protested. "If he has no family, we can be his family for a day, right?" Miguel's childish logic left her without arguments. Finally, she sighed and stroked his hair. "You're a child with a very big heart, you know," she said, kissing his forehead.
"Now,
let's go home. We have to prepare the dough for the last tamale orders." The next 2 days passed in feverish activity. Joanna cleaned the SES mansion in the morning, picked up Miguel from school, prepared and delivered her sweet orders in the afternoon, and at night, with the child asleep, She meticulously cleaned her small apartment and planned every detail of the Christmas dinner. On the night of December 23rd, while sewing a small tear in the tablecloth she reserved for special occasions, she wondered for the umpteenth time if she hadn't made a serious mistake by inviting Antonio SES. What could a domestic employee and single mother have in common with a millionaire businessman? The answer came immediately to her mind. Loneliness. Different types of loneliness in absolutely disparate contexts, but loneliness all the
same.
Christmas Eve morning, Antonio surprised her with an unexpected announcement. You can leave at noon today, Joanna, he said during breakfast. I suppose you have preparations to attend to. Thank you, sir, she replied, genuinely grateful for those extra hours to finish details. And you won't need to come until the 26th, he added, looking up from his newspaper. Consider it a small Christmas bonus. Joanna felt her eyes moisten. That additional day off meant being able to spend all of Christmas Day with Miguel, without the usual morning rush. Thank you very much, Mr. SES, she said with a slightly broken voice. Antonio nodded, uncomfortable with her emotion. We'll see each other tonight then, he said, returning to his newspaper.
Joanna spent the
afternoon in feverish activity. She cleaned every corner of the small apartment, decorated the modest table with the newly mended tablecloth and the few presentable dishes she owned. She cooked carefully, following the traditional recipes she had learned from her grandmother. Codfish a la Viscaina, apple salad, hot punch without alcohol for Miguel. Part of her felt ridiculous putting so much effort into impressing a man accustomed to the most exclusive restaurants. But another part, deeper, did it out of pride to show that her home, though humble, had dignity and warmth. Miguel fluttered around her, more excited about the idea of a special guest than the proximity of Christmas gifts. Is the important man good? He asked while helping place paper napkins on the table. Yes, he's a good man, Joanna replied, surprising herself with the certainty of her answer. Despite his position and the social distance that separated them, in these weeks she had seen in Antonio an essentially decent person, though marked by a loneliness that seemed to have hardened his edges. At 6:30 in the evening, Joanna helped Miguel dress in his best clothes, dark pants and a light blue shirt they reserved for special occasions. Then she changed out of her domestic uniform into a simple dark green dress, the only one she owned for important events. She pulled her hair into a low bun and allowed herself a touch of lip gloss, more as a festive ritual than an attempt to dress up for her guest. At 7:05, Joanna's heart was pounding. What if Antonio had changed his mind? What if he considered visiting his domestic employee's house beneath his dignity and looked with disdain at the humility of her home? The clock struck 7. Miguel, sitting by the window, watched the street expectantly. The small Christmas tree, decorated with handmade ornaments by him, twinkled with its multicolored lights in a corner of the living room. At 7:05, the doorbell rang. Joanna took a deep breath, smoothed imaginary wrinkles from her dress, and headed to the
door.
Upon opening it, she found Antonio SES, impeccably dressed in a dark gray suit, holding what appeared to be several packages and bags. Good evening, Joanna, he greeted formally. I hope I'm not too late. Not at all, she replied, stepping aside to let him in. Please come in. Antonio entered the small apartment, and his eyes quickly scanned the
space.
Joanna held her breath, suddenly aware of how tiny and simple her home must seem to someone accustomed to ample and luxurious spaces. It was then that Miguel, unable to contain his curiosity a second longer, came running from his improvised hiding spot behind the sofa. Hello, sir, he exclaimed with the spontaneity of a 5-year-old. Are you Mom's friend? Joanna felt the blush rise to her
cheeks.
She had planned a more formal introduction, more controlled, but Miguel, with his impulsive nature, had taken the initiative. Antonio seemed momentarily disconcerted by the small figure watching him with bright eyes of curiosity. For an instant, Joanna feared he would feel uncomfortable or, worse, react coldly to the
child.
However, to her surprise, Antonio set the bags on the floor and crouched down to Miguel's level. Yes, I'm your mom's friend, he replied with a smile Joanna had never seen on his face. My name is Antonio. And you are Miguel, right? The child nodded, visibly impressed that this stranger knew his name. How did you know? He asked, narrowing his eyes with childish suspicion. Your mom has told me a lot about you, Antonio replied, maintaining that smile that seemed to transform his usually serious face. Joanna watched the scene with a mixture of astonishment and nervousness. It was as if two completely different worlds that should never have touched were colliding before her eyes. Mr. S.E.S., she began, feeling the need to regain some control. Allow me to take your coat, please. Tonight, I'm just Antonio, he replied, standing up and handing her the coat. As he did, his fingers lightly brushed hers, causing her a strange sensation like a small electric current. She pulled away quickly, confused by her own reaction. What's in the
bags?
Miguel asked, pointing to the packages Antonio had left on the floor. Miguel, Joanna gently reprimanded. Don't be nosy. No problem, Antonio intervened, picking up one of the bags. This one has some things for dinner. I hope you don't mind, he added, addressing Joanna. You mentioned you like red wine, so I brought a couple of bottles. And these are some traditional sweets.
I
thought Miguel might like them. You shouldn't have bothered, Joanna murmured, feeling a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. And this, Antonio continued, taking a larger rectangular package, is a small token to thank you for the invitation. You can open it after dinner if you like. Miguel watched the package with bright eyes, obviously thinking it was an early Christmas
gift.
Joanna, for her part, felt increasingly uncomfortable. She hadn't expected Antonio to bring gifts, and she had nothing to offer in return. Thank you, but it really wasn't necessary, she insisted. I know, he replied simply, but I wanted to. There was a moment of silence broken by Miguel's excited voice. Mom made codfish. It's a recipe from Grandma, and it's really good. Do you like codfish, Antonio?
The
familiarity with which Miguel addressed her guest made Joanna want the earth to swallow her. However, Antonio seemed to find it refreshing. I love codfish, he replied sincerely. And if it's a family recipe, I'm sure it'll be delicious. Joanna led them to the small table, carefully
set.
The candles bought on sale were lit, creating a warm atmosphere that disguised the imperfections of the modest apartment. The aroma of the codfish, mixed with traditional spices, floated in the air. As they sat down, Joanna noticed how Antonio carefully avoided looking too much around, as if sensing her discomfort at the abysmal difference between her home and the SES mansion. This small gesture of consideration surprised and somehow touched her. Sir, I confess that I am a single mother, she said suddenly, the words coming out of her mouth almost without thinking. Antonio looked directly into her eyes with an expression Joanna couldn't interpret. I know, Joanna, he replied softly, and allow me to say that I deeply admire your strength. Antonio's words hung in the air, enveloped in the aroma of the codfish and the warmth of the candles. Joanna was momentarily speechless, disconcerted by that unexpected compliment. No one in a long time had valued her daily struggle as something worthy of admiration. "I just do what any mother would," she finally murmured, serving him a generous portion of codfish alla Viscaina. "Are you mistaken?" Antonio replied with a frankness that surprised her. "Not everyone achieves what you've accomplished." Miguel watched the exchange with curiosity, his eyes going from his mother to this stranger who spoke so familiarly but maintained a strange formality in his posture. Try it," the child insisted, pointing to Antonio's plate. "Mom cooks better than all the restaurants." Joanna blushed at her son's enthusiasm. "Miguel, let Antonio eat in peace," she corrected. Antonio took a bite, and his expression changed subtly. "This is truly delicious, Joanna," he said, with genuine appreciation. "Miguel is right. It surpasses many restaurants I know." The dinner proceeded with a fluidity Joanna hadn't anticipated. To her surprise, Antonio turned out to be an attentive and considerate conversationalist, very different from the serious and distant man she knew from the mansion. He responded patiently to Miguel's incessant questions, ranging from "How many cars do you have?" to "Why don't you have children?" A question that made Joanna almost choke on her wine. "Miguel, you don't ask that," she reprimanded, embarrassed. But Antonio didn't seem bothered. "It's a good question," he replied, looking directly at the child. "I suppose because I dedicated myself too much to work and forgot how important it is to have a family." The sincerity of his response surprised Joanna. For an instant she saw something in Antonio's eyes she had never noticed before. Vulnerability, perhaps even regret. "And why do you work so much?" Miguel insisted, with that ability of children to ask the most uncomfortable questions. "Miguel, enough." Joanna intervened, worried that her son was making her guest uncomfortable. "No, it's okay," Antonio reassured her. He seemed to reflect for a moment before answering. "I work so much because for a long time I believed success was measured by what one achieves, not by what one lives." His words resonated deeply with Joanna. She, who had given up so many personal dreams to care for Miguel, had discovered that true wealth lay in those small shared moments. Laughter before bed, spontaneous hugs, even occasional tantrums. A modest but authentic life. The dinner continued with light conversations and anecdotes. Miguel told them about his school, his friends, his drawings. Antonio listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed he was really paying attention. Joanna watched this exchange with a mixture of astonishment and gratitude. When dessert time came, Joanna served the rice pudding she had prepared following her grandmother's traditional recipe. "In my house, we always ate this at Christmas," she explained while serving the small portions in the bowls she reserved for special occasions. "Where did you grow up, Joanna?" Antonio asked, taking a spoonful of the dessert. It was the first time he showed interest in her past, and Joanna hesitated for an instant. Talking about her childhood always felt bittersweet. "In a small town near Oaxaca," she finally replied. "My grandmother raised me after my parents died in an accident when I was 10. Antonio's expression softened. "I'm so sorry," he said sincerely. "It was a long time ago," she replied, downplaying it with a gesture. "My grandmother was wonderful. She taught me everything I know, especially cooking." "Well, she taught you very well," Antonio commented, savoring the rice pudding. "This is extraordinary. Grandma also made me rice pudding when I was sad." Miguel intervened with his face already smeared with the sweet dessert. "Are you sad, Antonio?" The question, so direct and unexpected, fell like a stone in a calm pond. Antonio seemed genuinely surprised. "Why do you think I'm sad?" he asked in turn.
softly.
Because you're alone on Christmas, Miguel replied with that crushing logic of children. And Mom says no one should be alone on Christmas. Joanna felt the blush rise to her cheeks. Miguel's words exposed with brutal honesty the compassion that had motivated her invitation, something she didn't want Antonio to perceive. She didn't want him to think she had invited him out of pity. Miguel, finish your dessert, she said, trying to change the subject. But Antonio didn't seem offended. On the contrary, he looked at Miguel with a thoughtful expression. Your mother is very wise, he finally said. And you're right, Miguel. Sometimes I am sad, though having company tonight makes me feel much better. The honesty of his response moved Joanna. It wasn't the diplomatic or evasive comment she would expect from a man in his position, but a direct admission of vulnerability. After dessert, Miguel, excited by the guests' presence and the expectations of Christmas Eve, began to yawn visibly. I think someone needs to go to bed if he wants Santa to find him asleep, Joanna commented, stroking her son's hair. But we haven't opened Antonio's gift yet, Miguel protested, pointing to the rectangular package still on the coffee table.
Joanna had
tried to deliberately ignore that gift, feeling certain discomfort. She wasn't used to receiving gifts, much less from her employer. It's quite late, she began to say. Maybe tomorrow. Please, Antonio insisted, surprising her with the softness of his tone. I'd like you to open it now. There was something in his look, a kind of vulnerable expectation, that made it impossible for Joanna to refuse. She nodded slightly, and Miguel, enthusiastic, ran to get the package. The child tore the paper with the impatience typical of his age, revealing a long box. Upon opening it, his eyes lit up with a spark of amazement. Mom, look, he exclaimed, lifting what appeared to be a professional art case. Joanna approached, as surprised as her son. The case contained professional quality watercolors, brushes of various sizes, colored pencils, pastels, all meticulously organized in compartments. It was exactly the type of gift she had vaguely mentioned to Antonio, but in an infinitely more luxurious version than she could ever afford. This is too much, she murmured, overwhelmed. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, Miguel exclaimed, examining each item with reverence. Thank you, Antonio. You're welcome, Miguel, he replied with a genuine smile. Your mom told me you like to
draw.
I hope this helps you create many masterpieces. Joanna watched the scene with a mixture of contradictory emotions. On one hand, Miguel's evident joy was a gift in itself. On the other, she felt certain discomfort at Antonio's generosity. She didn't want to establish a dynamic where she and Miguel were recipients of his charity. It's very generous of you, she finally said, unconsciously returning to formal
address.
But you shouldn't have spent so much. Antonio looked at her directly, perceiving her unease. I don't consider it an expense, but a pleasure, he replied simply. Besides, there's something else in the box. Miguel, still exploring the case, found a white envelope at the bottom. He handed it to his mother with curiosity. What is it, Mom? Joanna opened the envelope with slightly trembling hands. Inside was a Christmas card and a check.
Upon
seeing the amount written, she felt her breath catch. It was a sum that would resolve not only the immediate holiday expenses, but cover several months of rent. The initial discomfort transformed into something more complex. Wounded pride mixed with the pragmatic temptation to accept help she needed so badly, but her dignity prevailed. I can't accept this, she said firmly, extending the check toward Antonio. He made
no move to take it.
Please, Joanna, he said in a low but firm
voice.
It's not charity. If that's what worries you, consider it a Christmas bonus. It's too much for a bonus, she insisted. And I don't want you to think I invited you. Because, she stopped, aware that Miguel was watching them with curiosity. Miguel. Sweetie, she said, changing tone. Why don't you go brush your teeth? I'll come tuck you. And in a moment, the child, though visibly intrigued by the tension between the adults, nodded and reluctantly withdrew, taking his precious art case with him. Once alone, Joanna offered the check to Antonio again. I can't accept it, she repeated with determination. You've already been too generous with Miguel's gift. Antonio observed her carefully before speaking. Do you know how many gifts I received last Christmas? He asked, surprising her with the change of
topic.
Joanna shook her head, confused. 27, he replied. Expensive watches, exclusive whiskey, bottles, gold cufflinks, fountain pens, gifts from business associates, employees, seeking favor, people who want something from
me.
And do you know how many of those gifts really mattered to me? He didn't wait for her answer. None, he continued, because none came with the only thing that really matters. Sincerity. Tonight, you and Miguel have given me something money can't buy. You've treated me like a human being, not Antonio, says the businessman. For the first time in years, I've felt part of something authentic. Joanna was speechless at the unexpected vulnerability in his voice. Please accept it, he insisted, pointing to the check. Not for you, but for me, because you've reminded me what true generosity means, and I'd like to reciprocate in some way. Joanna looked at the check in her hand, feeling the weight of the decision. Her pride told her to reject it, but her pragmatism reminded her of all the pending needs, the roof leaks that worsened with every rain, the art classes Miguel wanted so much and she could never afford, the possibility of saving for a less precarious future. I'll accept it on one condition, she finally said, surprising herself. Antonio looked at her expectantly. That you allow me to repay it, she continued with determination. Not with money, but by working extra hours at the mansion when you need. A genuine smile lit up Antonio's face, transforming it
completely.
It's a fair deal, he replied, extending his
hand.
Joanna shook it, feeling a strange electricity in the brief contact.
For a
moment, both held each other's gaze, as if seeing something new and surprising. Mom, Miguel called from the bedroom, breaking the moment. I'm ready. Joanna withdrew her hand, suddenly aware of the intimacy of that instant. I have to tuck him in, she murmured, looking away. If you'd like to wait, we can have coffee after. I'd love to, Antonio replied softly. As Joanna headed to the bedroom, a confusing mixture of emotions boiled inside her.
What
was happening? How was it possible that in just a few hours, her relationship with Antonio, SES, had changed so drastically? From boss to guest. From guest to what exactly? Miguel was waiting, sitting on the bed, hugging his new art case, as if it were the most valuable treasure in the world.
Mom, is
Antonio going to visit us again? He asked as she tucked him in. I don't know, sweetie, she replied. Honestly, would you like him to? The child nodded enthusiastically. He's really nice and he makes you smile. Like when you tell me grandma's stories. Miguel's innocent observation left her momentarily speechless. Was her reaction to Antonio that obvious? She hadn't been aware of smiling in a special way. It's time to sleep, she said, kissing his forehead. Remember, Santa only comes when children are asleep. Do you think Santa will bring me a bicycle? Miguel asked, fighting the sleep that was beginning to overcome him. Joanna felt a pang of guilt. The bicycle had been Miguel's great wish, and she hadn't been able to fulfill it. The modest art set she had bought now overshadowed by Antonio's luxurious case, was all she could afford. Santa brings what he can, my love, she replied softly. But remember, the most important thing isn't the gifts, but knowing someone loves us enough to make us happy. Miguel nodded sleepily, his eyelids growing
Heavier.
I love you, Mom, he murmured before finally surrendering to sleep. I love you too, my life, she replied, adjusting the blankets around his small body. She stayed a few minutes watching him sleep, marveling as always at the peace radiating from his childish face. Then she took a deep breath and prepared to return to the living room where Antonio S.E.S. waited, a man who, in the course of one night, had ceased to be simply her employer to become something she didn't yet know how to define. When Joanna returned to the living room, she found Antonio standing by the window, watching the snow that had begun to fall softly. For an instant she allowed herself to look at him, without being seen. The elegant silhouette outlined against the glass, hands in pockets, a posture denoting power and security but also certain vulnerability in the way his gaze seemed lost in the night. It was strange to see him there in her small apartment, as if two parallel worlds had momentarily crossed. Miguel is asleep, she announced, breaking the silence. Antonio turned to her with a soft smile. He's an extraordinary child, he commented. He has your same intense gaze. And my stubbornness, according to Donna Carmen, Joanna added, heading to the kitchen. Coffee, or do you prefer a glass of wine? Coffee would be fine, thanks.
As she
prepared the drink, Joanna tried to order her thoughts. The evening had taken a completely unexpected
turn.
The Antonio says in her living room seemed a different person from the distant and serious man she worked for. Which of the two was the real one? Your son asked me something interesting while you were clearing the plates, Antonio commented when she returned with 2 steaming cups of coffee. What was it? Joanna asked, sitting on the armchair across from him and fearing another of Miguel's direct questions. He asked if I felt alone in my big castle, Antonio replied with a smile that didn't quite hide a certain melancholy. That's how he imagines the mansion. Joanna blushed slightly. I'm sorry, he has too much imagination and sometimes… No, he interrupted softly. It's a pretty accurate description. I told him yes, that sometimes big houses can feel very empty. A silence followed that wasn't uncomfortable but loaded with mutual understanding. They both sipped their coffee, allowing the warmth of the drink to contrast with the December cold seeping through the poorly sealed windows. May I ask you something personal? Joanna finally said, surprising herself with her boldness. Of course. Why did you never start a family? She asked, and seeing Antonio's surprised expression, she quickly added, Sorry, I shouldn't have. No, it's okay, he replied, setting his cup on the small coffee table. It's a fair question. I suppose, as I told Miguel, I focused too much on building an empire and forgot to build a life. The frankness of his response moved Joanna. It wasn't the rehearsed explanation she would expect from a man in his position. Was there never someone special? She insisted, pushed by a curiosity she didn't fully understand herself. Antonio seemed to reflect for a moment. There was someone many years ago, he finally replied. Mariana. We studied together at university. She wanted to be an artist. I was obsessed with following in my father's footsteps in business. He paused as if searching for the precise words. When my father died unexpectedly, I found myself at the head of the family company sooner than expected. I was 23 and had a lot to prove. Work consumed everything, including my relationship with Mariana. She wanted a different life, simpler, more centered on what really matters. He looked up at Joanna. A life more like the one you've built with Miguel. Joanna felt a strange sensation in her chest at this unexpected comparison. My life has nothing special, she replied. Honestly, I work hard. I worry about paying the bills. I try to be a good mother. Precisely, Antonio said with an intensity that surprised her. You have clear what matters.
I lost that.
Clarity somewhere along the way.
The
confession hung between them like an invisible bridge. Joanna had never imagined that a man with Antonio Cesa's success and wealth could feel he lacked something fundamental. It's never too late to find what matters, she murmured, surprising herself with the intimacy of her comment. Antonio looked at her directly, his dark eyes reflecting an emotion she couldn't decipher. I hope so, he simply replied. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the faint clink of the cups when they set them on the table. Through the window, the snowflakes continued to fall, creating a white curtain that seemed to isolate them from the outside world.
Miguel
told me he'd like a bicycle, Antonio commented suddenly, changing the subject. He said he wrote to Santa asking for one. Joanna felt a pang of guilt. The bicycle had been Miguel's great wish for months, but it was completely out of her budget. Yes, it's his biggest dream, she replied, with some sadness, but he'll have to settle for something more modest this year. Antonio seemed to want to say something, but held back. Instead, he checked his watch and
seemed surprised by the time.
I should go, he said, standing up. It's late, and tomorrow will be a special day for Miguel. Joanna nodded, feeling an inexplicable disappointment at the prospect of the evening ending. She stood to walk him to the door, where Antonio picked up his coat. Thank you for tonight, Joanna, he said.
Sincerely.
It's been the best Christmas Eve I've had in many years. Thank you for joining us, she replied. And for Miguel's gift. I've never seen him so excited. Antonio smiled, and in a gesture that took Joanna by surprise, he gently took her hand. I'd like to invite you and Miguel to spend Christmas Day at the mansion, he said with a tone mixing decision and vulnerability. The winter garden is perfect for a child to play, and there's a fireplace where we could roast chestnuts like my mother did when I was ill. The proposition left Joanna momentarily speechless. The idea of spending Christmas Day at the SES mansion seemed as implausible as if Antonio had suggested a trip to the moon. I don't know if it would be appropriate, she finally replied, aware of the complications that could arise from further blurring the lines between employer and employee. Besides, Miguel and I have our own Christmas traditions. A shadow of disappointment crossed Antonio's face but was quickly replaced by resigned understanding. Of course, I understand, he said gently, releasing her hand. It was just an idea. He put on his coat and prepared to leave. But before opening the door, he turned to her. May I ask one last question? He said calmly.
Sure. Why did you really invite me?
His gaze was direct, almost penetrating. And please, don't tell me just because no one should be alone on Christmas. The question caught Joanna off guard. She herself hadn't deeply reflected on the motives that had led her to make that impulsive invitation. Had it really been just compassion as she had said at first, or was there something more? Something she didn't even dare to name? I don't know, she replied honestly. Maybe because, despite your position and success, I saw in you something I recognized in myself. What? Antonio asked, intrigued. Joanna took a deep breath before answering. Loneliness, she said simply. A different loneliness from mine, but equally deep. Antonio looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as his employee, not as The single mother who had invited her boss to dinner, but as someone who had managed to see beyond the facade he presented to the world. "Thank you for your sincerity," he finally said with a smile that transformed his face. "And thank you for seeing what few see."
And
With that, he opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Joanna watched him walk away toward the elevator, an elegant and solitary figure against the dim hallway light.
Mary.
"Christmas, Antonio," she said just before the elevator doors closed. "Merry Christmas, Joanna," he replied with one last smile that stayed etched in her memory. She closed the door and leaned her back against it, exhausted but strangely vitalized. The evening had been surreal, like a parenthesis in her everyday life. Tomorrow she would return to reality.
She
Would still be the domestic employee, and Antonio SES, the powerful businessman she worked for. The check she had reluctantly accepted now rested in the kitchen drawer, a tangible reminder of the disparity in their worlds. And yet, something had changed that night, something fundamental, though indefinable. Antonio had ceased to be a distant figure and had become a real person with vulnerabilities and insecurities of his own. And she, who had always maintained careful, professional distance, found herself thinking of him in a way that unsettled her. She went to her bedroom, where Miguel slept, deeply hugging his new art case.
She
Contemplated him with tenderness, wondering how he would react when he woke up the next day and discovered that Santa hadn't brought the bicycle he wanted so much. The modest art set she had bought, now overshadowed by Antonio's luxurious gift, would seem even more insufficient. She lay down next to her son, inhaling the scent of children's shampoo in his hair.
as
Sleep began to overcome her. Antonio's words about loneliness echoed in her mind, mingling with the image of his smile as he said
goodbye.
a smile she had never seen during her weeks working at the mansion. Perhaps, she thought as she drifted into sleep, perhaps we are all alone until someone dares to really see who we are. The next morning, Miguel's enthusiastic shout woke her abruptly. Mom, come quick," the child exclaimed, jumping on the bed.
Santa
Came and brought something big. Joanna sat up, disoriented by the sudden awakening. Miguel was already running to the living room, unable to contain his excitement.
She
Followed, rubbing her eyes to clear them, wondering what had provoked such a reaction. In her son, the modest gift she had left by the small tree the night before could hardly justify so much euphoria. When she entered the living room, she stopped, dead in her tracks, next to the Christmas tree where there should only be the small package she had left shone a red bicycle
with a huge bow.
exactly the model Miguel had cut out from a catalog and pasted in his letter to Santa. "It's just like the one I asked for,"
Miguel
shouted, circling the bicycle as if afraid it might disappear. "Santa knew, Mom. He knew." Joanna stood, paralyzed, unable to process what she saw. She hadn't bought that bicycle. She couldn't have afforded it, even saving for months. There was only one possible explanation. Antonio. Next to the bicycle was a small
card.
With trembling hands, Joanna took it and opened it. Inside, in elegant handwriting, it read, "The wishes of good children deserve to come true. Santa." There was no signature, but it wasn't necessary. Joanna felt a confusing mix of emotions: gratitude, embarrassment, a touch of indignation at the liberty he had taken, and something else, something warm and disconcerting expanding in her chest. At that moment, the phone rang. With her heart pounding, Joanna picked up the receiver. "Hello," she said, though she already knew who would be on the other end. "Merry Christmas, Joanna," replied Antonio Sez's deep, familiar voice. Santa has passed by your house. And despite all her confusion and the complications she sensed, Joanna couldn't help but smile. You shouldn't have done it. Those were Joanna's first words, though the severe tone she tried to project was undermined by the smile she couldn't contain at seeing Miguel's happiness. I don't know what you're talking about, Antonio replied with feigned innocence. Apparently, Santa has very good taste in bicycles. Miguel was pedaling in circles around the small living room, skillfully avoiding the scarce furniture with an expression of absolute bliss on his childish face. It's the best Christmas in the world, he exclaimed every few minutes, as if needing to reaffirm the reality of his joy. Joanna covered the receiver with her hand. Miguel, sweetie, go get dressed. After breakfast, we can go down to the park to try the bicycle properly. The child nodded enthusiastically and ran to his room, not without first caressing the handlebar of his new treasure. Once more, you really shouldn't have done it, Joanna repeated when she was alone, this time with more seriousness. I appreciate the intention, but it's too much. A child's happiness is never too much. Antonio replied with a softness that contrasted with his usual professional tone. Besides, consider it my gift to myself. I don't remember the last time I felt so good doing something for someone. There was a brief silence loaded with unspoken words. Even so, Joanna began. Would you accept an invitation to lunch today? He interrupted, surprising her again. Nothing formal, just you, Miguel, and me. Maybe in the park near your house, so Miguel can break in his bicycle. Joanna bit her lip, indecisive. Part of her wanted to maintain distance, re-establish the professional boundaries that Christmas Eve had blurred. But another part, growing with each minute, felt inexplicably drawn to the version of Antonio says she had met the night before. Vulnerable, sincere, attentive. I don't know, Antonio, she finally replied. This is complicated. Life is complicated, Joanna, he said with a soft laugh, but sometimes it's worth risking the complications. Before she could respond, Miguel reappeared in the living room, already dressed, though with his shirt buttoned.
Wrong.
I'm ready, Mom, he announced practically, vibrating with enthusiasm. Can we go to the park now? Give me a minute, sweetie, she replied,
Pointing to the phone.
Then, addressing Antonio again. I have to hang up now.
And
about the invitation, she paused, surprising herself with the decision she was about to
make.
We'll be at Alameda Park at noon, she finally said. I'll be there if you want to join us. Antonio replied, and Joanna could imagine his smile on the other end of the line. After hanging up, she stood for a moment staring at the phone, wondering if she had just made a serious mistake. As a domestic employee, she knew perfectly well that mixing professional and personal rarely ended well. And yet, there was something in this situation, in this unexpected connection with Antonio, that pushed her to break her own rules. Alameda Park was especially beautiful that Christmas morning. The light snowfall from the night before had left a white blanket now shining under the winter sun. There were few people, mostly families with children breaking in their Christmas gifts. Miguel rode the paths on his new bicycle, going far enough to feel freedom, but always staying in Joanna's sight, who watched him from a bench while adjusting her scarf against the cold. He has natural talent, said a voice behind her. Joanna turned to find Antonio walking toward her. He was dressed casually, something she had never seen him in: dark jeans, a wool sweater under an elegant but not ostentatious coat, and a scarf that highlighted the color of his
eyes.
Without the formal suit, he looked younger, more accessible, more human. He's been practicing with a neighbor's borrowed bicycle, she replied, making space for him on the bench. Though Never on one as nice as this. Antonio sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance that, however, didn't prevent Joanna from being intensely aware of his presence. Are you still upset about the gift? He asked with a slightly mischievous smile that gave him a youthful air. I'm not upset, Joanna clarified, just worried about what it means. What do you think it means? Antonio asked, his gaze fixed on Miguel, who was now approaching, pedaling upon seeing him. Joanna didn't have time to respond. Miguel braked in front of them, his cheeks flushed from effort and cold. Antonio, he exclaimed with the familiarity of greeting an old friend. Look, what Santa brought me. Isn't it great? Impressive, Antonio replied with genuine enthusiasm. It seems Santa knew exactly what you wanted. Miguel nodded vehemently. I told Mom Santa is magic.
He knew I wanted
this bicycle even though my letter got lost. His eyes shone with the unwavering faith of childhood. Joanna and Antonio exchanged a complicit look, a small complicity that felt surprisingly natural. Do you want to take a ride with me? Miguel asked Antonio, taking him by surprise. Can you push me down the big hill? Antonio looked at Joanna as if asking permission.
She
nodded with a smile. I'd love to, he replied, standing up. Though it's been years since I played in the snow. It's easy, Miguel assured with the confidence of an expert. You just have to have fun. Joanna watched them walk away, her small son on the shiny red bicycle and the powerful businessman walking beside him, adapting his steps to the child's rhythm, listening attentively to Miguel's enthusiastic explanations about the different speeds and the brake. There was something surreal about that scene, as if it belonged to a parallel universe where social and economic differences
didn't exist.
And yet, there they were in a snow-covered park on Christmas Day, a single mother with financial difficulties, a 5-year-old boy, and one of the city's richest men, sharing a moment of simple joy.
She followed them with
her eyes as they climbed the small park hill. Antonio helped Miguel push the bicycle uphill, and then both descended, the child pedaling and shouting with excitement, the adult running beside him as if he were 20 years younger, with a smile that Joanna had never seen at the mansion.
Seeing them like
that, she felt a bittersweet pang in her chest. Miguel had never had a father figure to play with him that way. Since his birth, it had been just the two of them against the world. Joanna had compensated as best she could for that absence, but she knew certain spaces could only be filled by the male presence her son had never had.
Are
you having fun?
Joanna asked when they
returned, Miguel panting with excitement and Antonio with his hair tousled by the wind. Antonio runs really fast, Mom, Miguel exclaimed, and he pushed me so hard I almost flew. With care, I hope, Joanna replied, giving Antonio a look of feigned severity. Absolute safety guaranteed, he assured, raising a hand in a solemn gesture. Though his eyes sparkled with youthful enthusiasm. Though I must admit your son is quite daring. I know, Joanna sighed. I don't know where he gets it from. Maybe his mother, Antonio suggested, surprising her. It takes a certain kind of courage to raise a child alone in this world. His words said so naturally touched something deep in Joanna. She had never thought of her situation as an act of courage. For her, it had always been simply what she had to do, the responsibility she had assumed when she decided to have Miguel despite his father's absence. Are you hungry? Antonio asked skillfully, changing the subject upon noticing her emotion. I know a small restaurant nearby that opens on Christmas. They make the best tortilla soup in the city. The restaurant turned out to be a cozy family establishment with warm-colored walls and traditional Mexican decor. Despite it being Christmas, several families were enjoying the homemade food. The owner greeted Antonio like an old friend, to Joanna's surprise. "Don Antonio, what a pleasure to see you," the middle-aged man exclaimed, shaking his hand warmly. "It's been a while since you visited us." "Too much work, Ramon," Antonio replied.
But
"Today I wanted to share your soup with some special friends." Joanna noted the naturalness with which he had called them special friends and wondered if, for him, it was just a formality or if he really saw them that way. The idea provoked a strange warmth in her chest. Ramon seated them at a table by the window, from where they could see the snowy
park.
Miguel, hungry after his bicycle adventure, devoured the tortilla soup and the tamales served to him, interspersing bites with enthusiastic accounts of his morning. "How did you discover this place?" Joanna asked Antonio while Miguel drew on the paper tablecloth the restaurant provided for children. "By accident years ago," he replied, toying with his spoon. "I had a car breakdown nearby. Before the neighborhood became trendy, I came in looking for a phone and stayed for the soup. Since then, I come when I need to. Remember, there are simple things money can't improve." The honesty of his response, the implicit vulnerability in admitting he valued simplicity, continued to surprise Joanna. Each new facet of Antonio, SES, she discovered, seemed to contradict the image of the cold, distant businessman she knew from the mansion. "Why do you never show yourself like this at work?" she asked, unable to contain herself. "You seem like a completely different person." Antonio seemed to reflect seriously on the question. "I suppose over the years I built a version of myself I thought was necessary for success," he finally replied. "An armor. And after so long it became easier to keep it on than to take it off." Their gazes met over the table, and Joanna felt a connection that transcended their differences. Both, in their own way, had built defenses to survive their own battles. He by isolating himself emotionally behind a facade of success, she by forging an iron independence that left no room for vulnerability. "And what made you take it off last night?" Joanna asked softly. Antonio looked at her directly with an intensity that almost made her look away. "You," he simply replied. "Your invitation, your sincerity, the way you looked at me not as Antonio says, the businessman, but as a man alone on Christmas." The response left her speechless. There was a raw honesty in his voice that clashed completely with the calculating, distant man she knew. Or perhaps that man had never really existed. Just the armor he himself had described. Miguel, oblivious to the intensity of the moment, lifted his drawing to show them both. "Look, it's us in the park," he explained proudly. "You, me, and Antonio playing in the snow." Joanna observed the childish drawing. 3 stick figures under what seemed like a giant yellow sun, the middle one much smaller than the other two. The 3 were smiling with big curved smiles and lines from their hands joined, indicating they were holding hands. "It's beautiful, Miguel," she said, feeling a knot in her throat. Antonio also leaned in to look at the drawing, and an indecipherable expression crossed his face. "Do you like it?" Miguel asked, looking at him expectantly. "I love it," he replied with a strangely hoarse voice. "I think it's the best Christmas gift I've received." Joanna looked at him surprised, but Antonio was absorbed in the drawing, gently running a finger over the paper as if to memorize every stroke. For an instant, she thought she saw a moist gleam in his eyes, quickly contained. At that moment, Ramon approached the table with 3 plates of freshly made buñuelos, covered in sugar and cinnamon. "House dessert," he announced with a smile, "especially for the little artist." Miguel clapped enthusiastically as Ramon placed the plates in front of them. The delicious aroma of cinnamon and fried dough filled the air. "Thank you, Ramon," Antonio said, recovering his composure. "As generous as always." "It's a pleasure to see you accompanied, Don Antonio," the man replied with a warm smile. Before withdrawing, as they ate the buñuelos, they conversed about light topics: Miguel's upcoming school, vacations, a documentary about whales the child had recently seen and fascinated him, the Christmas traditions Joanna kept alive from her childhood. It was everyday chatter, simple, the kind families have around a table, and yet, for the three of them, each, for different reasons, it held extraordinary value. For Miguel, the excitement of sharing his interests with an adult who listened with genuine attention. For Joanna, the strange but pleasant feeling of not carrying the load alone, even if just for a few hours. For Antonio, the privilege of belonging, even momentarily, to something authentic and warm. When they finally left the restaurant, despite Joanna's protests, Antonio had insisted on paying the bill. The sun was beginning to set, tinting the winter sky with golden and reddish hues. "We should go," Joanna said, seeing Miguel starting to show signs of tiredness after so much activity. "It's been a wonderful day, Antonio.
Thank
you for everything." There was so much sincerity in her voice that Antonio seemed momentarily disconcerted, as if unaccustomed to receiving genuine gratitude. "The pleasure has been mine," he finally replied. Truly. They looked at each other for an instant, both aware that something had changed between them, something that could no longer be ignored when they returned to their usual roles of employee and employer. "See you Thursday?" he asked, referring to the day Joanna was to return to work after her small Christmas bonus. "I'll be there," she replied with a soft
smile.
Antonio crouched down to say goodbye to Miguel, who, to both adults' surprise, hugged him spontaneously. For a second, Antonio seemed unsure how to react, but then he returned the hug with a naturalness that moved Joanna. "Thank you for playing with me," Miguel said. "Will you come again another day?" The innocent question hung in the air, loaded with implications the adults understood
perfectly.
"I'd love to," Antonio replied, looking at Joanna as if asking permission. She nodded slightly, unable to refuse the hope in her son's eyes. As they watched Antonio walk away toward where he had parked his car, Miguel waving enthusiastically in farewell, Joanna wondered what she was getting into. The day had been perfect, almost like a
dream.
But what would happen when reality imposed itself again? When she was once more the domestic employee and he the powerful businessman. However, as they walked home, Miguel pedaling slowly beside her on his shiny new bicycle, she decided that for once she wouldn't anticipate worries. This day had been an unexpected gift, and she would keep it as such, without questioning or analyzing it until it wore out. And if a feeling she didn't dare name was beginning to bloom in her heart, she could at least allow herself, for today, the luxury of not fighting it. Thursday came too soon. During the 2 days following Christmas, Joanna had tried to convince herself that the time shared with Antonio had been just a parenthesis, a special but isolated moment that shouldn't affect their professional relationship. However, as she headed to the SES mansion that morning, she knew something fundamental had changed. Upon arriving, she used her key to enter through the service door. As always, the mansion was silent, and Joanna assumed Antonio would be in his office as usual. She went to the kitchen to start her tasks, trying to ignore the nervousness she felt at the inevitable encounter. "Good morning, Joanna." Antonio's voice startled her. He was in the kitchen, sitting at the table, with a cup of coffee, as if he had been waiting for her. He wasn't wearing his usual formal suit but casual pants, and a sweater that made him look more accessible, more like the man she had shared Christmas with than the distant businessman she worked for. "Good morning, sir," Joanna replied, automatically, then correcting herself. "Good morning, Antonio." He smiled, noticing her hesitation. "I made coffee," he said, pointing to the coffee pot. "Will you join me?" Joanna hesitated for an instant. Sharing a coffee with her employer before starting her tasks wasn't part of the established routine, but nothing between them seemed to follow the usual routines anymore. "Thank you," she replied, serving herself a cup and sitting across from him.
There was a
moment of silence, not entirely uncomfortable, but charged with expectation. "How is Miguel?" Antonio finally asked. "He hasn't stopped talking about you," Joanna replied with a smile. "And about the bicycle, of course. Yesterday, we spent the whole afternoon in the park so he could keep practicing." Antonio nodded, visibly pleased. "He's an extraordinary child," he commented. "He has your same ability to see the best in people." The compliment took her by surprise. Joanna lowered her gaze to her coffee, unable to hold the intensity in Antonio's eyes. "Joanna," he continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "there's something I need to talk to you about." Joanna's heart skipped a beat. Had he regretted the familiarity of the last few days?
Would
he re-established professional distance between
them?
"Of course," she replied, trying to prepare for the worst. "I can no longer be your employer," Antonio said, direct as always. Joanna felt the ground open beneath her feet. Despite all her fears, she hadn't considered the possibility of losing her job.
Had she
crossed some unforgivable line? Had she completely misinterpreted the situation? "I understand," she managed to say, struggling to maintain composure. "If I've done something inappropriate." No, he interrupted, reaching out to take her hand on the table. "You've
misunderstood me.
I don't want to be your employer."
Why?
"Because I want the right to get to know you in another way."
The
confession left her momentarily speechless. "In another way," she repeated, unsure of what he was suggesting. Antonio nodded with a vulnerability in his gaze she had never seen until Christmas Eve. "These days with you and Miguel have been the most authentic I've lived in years," he explained. "They've reminded me what it feels like to be alive, connected to something real. I don't want to go back to the formality of before, to pretending this connection between us doesn't exist." Joanna felt the blush rise
to her cheeks.
Antonio's direct honesty disarmed her
completely.
"But I'm your employee," she objected weakly. "You don't have to be," he replied. "I've been thinking about this for the last few days. I have a proposal for you." Joanna looked at him expectantly, still not withdrawing her hand from his. "Ramon's restaurant is looking for a chef specialized in traditional pastry," Antonio continued. "I mentioned your Christmas sweets and he's interested in meeting you. It would be a better paid job with hours that would allow you more time with Miguel, and you'd do what you truly love." Joanna blinked in surprise. It was not at all what she expected to hear. "How do you know pastry is my passion?" she asked, amazed that he had perceived something she hadn't even clearly articulated herself. Antonio smiled. "From the way you talked about your grandmother's recipes, the sparkle in your eyes when you mentioned the sweets you prepared. Some people work to live, others live to
create.
You're one of the latter." The precision of his observation moved her deeply. For years, she had stifled her love for traditional pastry under the weight of daily survival, turning it into a means to an end rather than the passion it once was. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. "Say you'll think about it," Antonio replied. "You don't have to decide anything now, and I want you to know there are no hidden conditions." If you decide to accept Ramon's offer, it would be exclusively for your talent, not as a favor to me. And if you decide to keep working here, I'll respect your decision. Joanna nodded slowly, processing everything she had just heard. And the other part, she finally asked, gathering courage. The getting to know each other in another way. Antonio looked at her directly, without hesitation. That part is independent, he replied. Honestly, I'd like to get to know you, Joanna, and Miguel, to build something genuine without the complications of an employer-employee relationship, but that depends entirely on
You.
Joanna fell silent, overwhelmed by Antonio's sincerity.
For so long, she had
Been alone, carrying all the responsibilities, building walls to protect herself and Miguel, that the idea of allowing herself to be vulnerable with someone was terrifying. I'm scared, she finally admitted, surprising herself with her frankness.
Not
Just for me, but for Miguel.
He's already
Excited about you. If this doesn't work, she left the sentence unfinished, but Antonio understood perfectly. I'm scared too, he confessed gently, squeezing Joanna's hand. It's been a long time since I allowed myself to feel anything real. It's safer to hide behind success, possessions, image. But these days with you and Miguel have made me realize how empty my life has been.
his
Words